let's have a frank conversation about, you want me to say race, don't you? You want me to say race? Practical solutions to criminal justice problems.
And so we begin This Week in Common Sense for the third week of June 2020. And you're Paul Jacob, and you're talking about the big stories that appeared this week on thisiscommonsense.org.
Well, I'm glad to know that I'm Paul Jacob. I have always wanted to be Paul Jacob, and I don't know if people know that, but that's always been my goal. Here I am. That was from, we took that opening from Wednesday's commentary, Unfriending the Police. But we had two this week that really dealt with criminal justice and kind of where we are on that issue as a nation. And the first one was the coming backlash, which was on Monday. And, there's been all this about defunding the police. And, of course, to bleed into Wednesday's commentary, which was Unfriending the Police, the whole idea of defunding the police is attractive to me in one key way right off the bat, which is we've got huge government supporting people wanting to defund something. This is, to my knowledge, this is the first time ever on any issue at any time that a lot of people on the left said, let's spend less money. And so I think those of us in the middle, on the right, favoring limited government, ought to take them up on it and say, okay, let's go step 2 and step 3. How do we spend less money? But the interesting thing, and one of the points we made on Monday in the coming backlash, was pointing out that if you're defunding the police, if you are not trusting the police to have what is called a monopoly on force, the government, in essence, has a monopoly on force and in essence doesn't. They have theoretically this ability to have much bigger force. But the beauty of America, in my humble opinion, is that we as collective individuals have more force, more firepower than our government. That is not true in a lot of countries in this world. The people are in essence disarmed, and the authorities have the firepower advantage. In the United States of America, the most beautiful thing is that we, the people, have the firepower advantage because of all the private ownership of weapons. And there's been all this push that we need more gun control. The police are the only people who should have weapons. But if you're in the streets saying that you can't trust the police, that the police are killing people, and of course, not all the police, not everywhere, but police are killing people, and not just people of one race. They're killing people all across the board, and of course, some of the statistics on whether police are more likely to kill black people or white people or Hispanic people or so on and so on. If you look at per capita, well, then they're more likely to kill blacks than whites. If you start to look at crime statistics and go by not the percentage of the population, but the percentage of crimes committed by a certain, people in a certain race, then all of a sudden the killings separated by race don't look so out of whack. But of course, part of it is, to me, it's not so important that we determine precisely how much racism or not racism is going on. The important thing is that we stop police from killing people they shouldn't be killing, regardless of the race of the person killed or the race of the policeman. But anyway, we made that point on Monday that basically the idea of gun control is gone. It's out the window, because you cannot disarm the populace when even the people favoring gun control say you cannot trust the police. So why would you give them all the weapons in society? It's insane. The other part of Monday's commentary was about a study that is fascinating, and it looked at the riots that happened after Martin Luther King was murdered, assassinated. And, I think that the level of anger and, I think of that. I was 8 years old when it happened. But I think of the level of just rage in the Black community and a lot of, just sadness and horror across the board. But in those riots, and they were widespread, they then looked at the 1968 election. And I don't know all the, precise how they did everything in the study, but the bottom line was they said that the race riots that happened after the Martin Luther King assassination reduced the Democratic Party's vote by 2% in counties surrounding where there were problems and riots and so on and so on. And, it's a very interesting thing because it's easy to look at some of these things and say, well, they're going to get more press because of riots. It's going to make it more of a story. And that may lead to change. And while, we don't support rioting, maybe in the end, the silver lining is that it led people to change. Well, this is positing that, oh no, it led people to backlash. And although, maybe the vote for the Democrat or for the Republican was about different issues. But anyway, what they're looking at here is this was not helpful to the Democrats. This did not lead people to embrace reform. It led people to step back and say, we've got a big problem with violence. And what's interesting is that a fellow named David Shore, who is certainly, kind of a Democrat, personally favors Democrats over Republicans and so on, decided on Twitter that he would alert people to this study, let them know about this study. Hey, here's something that maybe these riots and, if the protests lead to riots, maybe that's not so good for us. Now, he didn't go into deep, analysis. He just posted it and gave people the information. He lost his job. He lost his job for posting truthful information, a study on Twitter, because there was a backlash that people didn't like the information. They didn't argue what he's saying is a lie because he was simply, here's the study. He wasn't verifying this study as gospel truth. He was merely providing the study. But people didn't want to hear it and were angry at having to hear truthful information they don't like. And so he had to go. And that takes all of this to a different level. It's not just a matter of, in some cases, whether you think a riot is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's literally that if you have an opinion about it, or even cite truths that are not helpful to somebody else's narrative, you may lose your job. And that, that's a whole different, level of dysfunction when you can't even discuss things. It's reminiscent to me of the Cultural Revolution in China. And so much, really, since Trump getting elected, and right after he was elected, you had the Berkeley situation. Wasn't that right after he got elected, or was that right before? I think it was right after. But you've had all these situations where America looks like, in our universities, looks like the Cultural Revolution, that everybody has to be, pilloried because they didn't say something just right, or they're part of some privileged class, or what have you. This is a recipe for disaster. And it's interesting because it sort of feeds into Tuesday's commentary, a modest extrapolation. And, Tuesday's commentary is really looking at this decision, Neil Gorsuch, who I disagree with here, because I don't think, I don't read the 64 Civil Rights Act when they said sex, I think they meant men and women and not gender or sexual orientation. And so I think I would have ruled differently. And I didn't read all the briefs and so on, and maybe I would have thought differently. It's not my main, issue, and I'm no expert on it. And really, we should only ever listen to experts.
That is the real message of this year.
We should all talk about a unifying laugh. The whole country should be laughing in unison about that. But anyway, Gorsuch had the position that when they said sex, the text of that in today's understanding would include sexual orientation and gender and other issues, and that those then are included. And so I disagree with him. I don't fault him as like cheating and, somehow he has a different opinion. And I look at it and I say, he's following his view. This isn't an aberration where he wanted to help some crony in some, insider legal case. This is a different point of view. And so, it really does not very much diminish my admiration for Gorsuch. I think he's the best judge on the court. But the interesting thing that we raised on Tuesday was we now have protections for race, for religion, for sexual orientation, for sex, for gender, at least if you're a protected class. If you're a traditionally discriminated against class, I don't believe that there's any protection in the 64 Civil Rights Act if you were to be fired for being a cisgender person, meaning that you're biologically a woman and you like men, or you're biologically a man and you like women, and so you don't have any grievance with our society somehow. Although I am cisgendered and I have plenty of grievances actually, but anyway, so those are our issues still in our society, although much less when you think of the 64 Civil Rights Act. You have to think back to a time in which businesses could not serve African Americans in large swaths of the country without the fear that their business might be firebombed, that their house, that their family might be attacked. In other words, the violence available, and in some cases, like in Mississippi or Alabama, where there's tremendous, obvious evidence that this was not just private violence, it was private-public partnership violence to impose a racist kind of apartheid in the South, and so this was pretty serious stuff, and a lot of libertarians are going to look at the 64 Civil Rights Act and say the government has no power to tell businesses who they have to serve or not serve. I'm very sympathetic to the 64 Civil Rights Act for the very reason that I don't know what else they could do. I think the level of violence that was real and threatened against business owners required some sort of response. And while I don't think that's a perfect response by a long shot, I think I would have voted for it, just to create some change. Because I think at a certain point, you have to deal with reality. And if the theory doesn't get you to a place where people are free and not scared and not bullied and not intimidated into something less than full-fledged freedom, I think that's what you have to work toward. So all of that being said, today the threat of discrimination on all these levels is so much reduced. And today, one of the main threats is against people who say something that's not politically correct. What's his name with I'm going to forget his name, so close on the tip of my tongue, but the guy with the Houston Rockets who was in the front office. He wasn't the owner or the general manager, but he might have been the general manager. He was somebody with the Houston Rockets. And he tweeted something about Stand with Hong Kong and who are fighting for their freedom. And of course, China, the CCP, the bosses, the butchers of Beijing they don't like anybody to say anything about Hong Kong or Tiananmen Square. They're very touchy. And so all of a sudden you had this big storm and China canceling things and people like LeBron James saying he didn't know what he was talking about and how outrageous that this person would have a political opinion, because that political opinion might cost LeBron some dough coming from China. We have seen this again and again where in our society at this moment, you are, I think, more threatened in terms of employment over something you say that's not politically correct than over your skin color or over your sexual orientation or over your religion or so on and so on. And so we just raised that. Now, we made very clear that we're not advocating that there be new civil rights legislation saying that you get to say whatever you want and no one can ever fire you for it. What we are suggesting is that having a government that polices all this stuff is never going to be the best way to have a better society where people aren't racist or sexist or where people get along. That you really have to meet people where they are. You have to be open to other people's opinions. And you have to have this back and forth in a society where you don't have the force of government coming in and saying, you will do this, you will do that. You can't be fired if you say this, but you can be fired if you say that. All of this, we need less government and we need more people weighing in. And it's not a matter of one of the ways you fight discrimination is by people power. Someone says, hey, that store discriminated against me, don't shop there. So I'm not saying to people, your boycott of a certain store is bad. I mean, I think at a certain point, some of these boycotts can be overblown, but that's a great way to enforce a better behavior among businesses, among politicians for that matter. Boycott them and vote for somebody else if you have a decent choice. Difference is in the marketplace, you almost always have better choices than you do in elections. And as a golden example of that, this election, you get to choose between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So that's think about any product you want, and you've got better choices than Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So the third commentary is Unfriending the Police. And the reason I wanted this title, because I think you said, what does this title mean? But it felt like to me, in Facebook land, and then one of my favorite little quotes I saw somewhere was that sometimes in real life you need to unfriend people, and which I think is true. But in the whole Facebook culture, you're going to friend or unfriend somebody, and that it's almost gotten to be this virtue signaling that I'm against the police or I'm for the police. If you have different, virtue sets, as if all police are good or all police are bad, and that's not going to get us there. we're not going to have a society where everyone agrees that the police are terrible, so we get rid of all the police. How do you defend yourself? And how do you protect property? People are going to hire private police. And then, of course, who's going to hire the private police? Well, it's going to be the wealthier people who can afford the better police. So, we have to have some sensible look at all this, and not just have kind of knee-jerk bumper sticker, responses. And I also, in this commentary, Unfriending the Police, raise some issues that I think are important. And I use Radley Balco, who writes for the Washington Post and has written some great things. What was his big book, the militarization of police or something? I can't believe I can't pull his book, but The Warrior Cop, I think, was his big book. But he's done a bunch of stuff. He's been wonderful. We started writing about Corey May, who was a guy in Mississippi. I'm going on a long tangent here, but killing them all. But a guy in Mississippi who the police used a no-knock raid, came into his house, was the wrong place. They're looking to bust somebody for drugs. It wasn't Corey May. And he doesn't know what to do. Someone's breaking in his house. He's got his gun. He fires and he shoots and kills the policeman. And of course, they do the usual, let's charge him with all kinds of things, including murder. And they convict him of murder, and he is waiting on death row. Now, he did nothing but be awakened in the middle of the night with someone breaking into his home and defend himself. Anyway, Radley Balco made Corey May a cause celeb and alerted people like me and this is commonsense.org. And we must have done 7, 10 or more commentaries about what was happening. In the end, they ended up releasing Corey May. And so instead of being killed for self-defense that was totally justified, I mean, it's terrible that a policeman lost his life, but it's not Corey May's fault. So instead of being executed, is a free man today. So, hats off to Radley Balco, and have always been a big fan. And Balco makes the point, which I don't think he provides a bunch of evidence and studies and analysis. I'm not as convinced as he is that that our problems with criminal justice are as much racism as they are other things, like that police like to police in poor neighborhoods where they can't lawyer up. And so, of course, they're going to be policing in more poor neighborhoods. And because socioeconomically, blacks as a whole are higher represented in poorer communities, there's going to be more of that. I think you also have stereotypes that are very harmful, and that's part racism, of course. But anyway, one of the things that Balco does is to make the point that there's a lot of evidence of disproportionality in enforcement and other things and aspects of the criminal justice system that are racist. And I agree with him. But whether you agree with him or not, one of the most important things he says, and this has been such a burr under my saddle, because I hear constantly about race, and I keep thinking, wait a second, a huge portion of this country is not black, and they have plenty to fear from police and from criminal justice abuse. Why are we leaving them out of the concern circle? Wouldn't we want everybody who fears that they could be killed in some mishap involving the police, or abused or brutalized in some way by bad policemen who aren't being reined in? That's not just a black problem. That is a black and white and Hispanic and Asian and every other type of person problem. And Balco points that out, that a lot of white people, he says, lots of white people are wrongly accused, arrested, and convicted, treated unfairly, beaten, and unjustifiably shot and killed by police officers. So that, to me, that's critical, because otherwise this becomes all about race. And I think for some white folks, especially if you live in certain parts of the country where there's not many black people living there, if you're living in Idaho or Montana or something, why should you even pay attention? You should pay attention because it's not all about race. It's about a criminal justice system that's broken. And it's not just broken for black folks, it's broken for white folks too. And that doesn't mean that black folks aren't getting it worse. It just means that if you think you're safe because your wife might protect you, but in mine, anyway. But if you think you're safe because you're white, you're mistaken. The other interesting thing about this, and the point we make with Unfriending the Police, is that we have to do things that change the dynamic. And the idea of having some macho revolutionary slogan, does it change behavior or does it not change behavior? And I don't see any evidence it changes behavior. And I think we have to keep making the point that if there's a problem of too much policing, bad policing maybe, but part of it is things like the war on drugs, which has not only enabled but in fact encouraged the police to be much more intrusive, much more aggressive, has given them huge additional powers. The whole RICO thing, civil asset forfeiture, where we turn police into basically folks who go pilfer from people and steal their stuff and make it to where, we got some nice things for down at the station, but we had to steal it from some people through civil asset forfeiture. It has corrupted the police in the same way that we know during Prohibition in the 30s, in the 20s, and you had police forces all over the country corrupted by the money of the mob, because alcohol being illegal, all of a sudden there were big profits, in the same way that there are big profits on drugs today. And it is fueling organized crime. So I make the point, stop the drug war. We have to do real things to pull back the police. And it doesn't mean there's a zillion other reforms. We've talked about qualified immunity and ending it. We've talked about ending civil asset forfeiture. We've talked about getting rules written, because we have police cameras all over the country now. In most police forces, I think, have cameras. But they don't have any rules. No one's written any rules that require them to wear them, to turn them on. And let me tell you, a camera that's not turned on is not nearly as effective as a camera that is. And to make them release that footage in a set legal way that can protect people who are part of that footage that don't deserve to be disclosed, but also that the public, the whole point of having the cameras is when something horrible goes down, the public doesn't have to feel like they're not going to ever find out what happened. And so they need, the whole point of having the cameras is to let the people see what the cameras picked up. So there's all kinds of things that need to be done. But if we think we're just going to do a couple of reforms and not take any major look at what's being policed and what should be policed and what shouldn't, then again, we're going to miss this, golden opportunity for reform.
One of the things that we keep on coming back to is, of course, when you talk about getting rid of the war on drugs, which is one of your themes here, which would de-escalate the police, is that because of the war on drugs, police departments around the country have been militarized and armed even when unnecessary. Many state troopers, when we were young, weren't carrying any weapons with them. That is, they weren't carrying. There was no sidearms, because all they're doing is really enforcing simple road rules. But now they're all carrying weapons, and it escalates everybody. Everybody's a little more on edge that way.
Yes. No, it's the militarization of police, and it is in part due to the drug war, but it's not just that. It's also due to the fact that we've engaged in a couple of conflicts in the Middle East that don't make a lot of sense, and we built the military's bought a bunch of hardware, And then it runs, what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to give it free to police forces. Isn't that a nice thing? And everybody loves it. They get something for free. You're making good use of taxpayer resources or whatever. But now you've got police forces with these military vehicles, and there's no way you can put those on the street and be a person living in that town and not feel like you're now under military occupation. And so, you have to look at some of those optics because they have repercussions.
The rest of the week wasn't very much about those issues, though. I mean, you had 3 in a row that were kind of on the same theme, but then the last 2 were a little bit different.
They were, and I think in many ways, 12 Monkeys in Charge, there's a lot of interest on Facebook and other places in this story. And I had actually seen this article, and we talked about it some weeks ago, when it came out that the U.S. had provided funds to a lab in Wuhan, and that Wuhan lab had gotten involved with this, what's the phrase? The gain function. They were doing experiments, gain of function experiments. Is that the right phrase?
Yeah, that's the right phrase.
Okay.
And the idea is the gain of function so that it can spread to humans.
Right.
I mean, that's the function we're talking about. It's kind of a funny way of putting it, isn't it?
Right. And in essence, what they're trying to do, and I don't claim to fully understand exactly how they do it all, but is to create these jumps. In other words, create a new virus so that you can practice overcoming that virus and let it mutate in some ways that are really nasty so you can practice getting rid of those nasty mutated viruses. There's an obvious little problem sometimes, though, especially if you're doing it at a lab that's not really seriously efficient and careful and accountable and so on and so on. And because you're creating these like super duper viruses, if they get out, that's really a bad thing. You've just created kind of a germ warfare agent. And of course, there are folks, and we linked to a person discussing one of the doctors. He's a Nobel Prize winner. Has been controversial. That's the way it goes sometimes. But he says this is a man-made virus, that this virus shows some indications that it was made in a laboratory. And who knows?
Right after the thing came out, it was it February or January, really early on in the whole pandemic, there were studies that, assured us it wasn't made in a lab, but that they had, their theories of why it couldn't have been made in a lab. It would have been unlikely. They didn't say couldn't. They said it would have been unlikely. But this isn't one of these people you linked to. Didn't the Indian doctor say that it looked an awful lot like the AIDS retrovirus?
Yes. I mean,
that's
some suggestion that there were parts of that virus in this virus. Again, this is kind of the blind leading the blind, because I don't understand enough about, the viruses and so on and how they work to really have any real sense of this. But I do have a sense of how politics works. And it appears, and there's I've been in some discussions with people who believe that Newsweek, which we quote here, got this wrong, that the Obama administration did not say you can't send any money, you can't spend money on this, that somehow they were okay with sending the money to China. Of course, it's a slightly different if you send the money to China than if you use it here. And so to get out of all the weeds of this, the bottom line is this: our U.S. taxpayer dollars went to a lab in Wuhan that was doing all kinds of, experiments to allow viruses to gain function and be able to be transmitted to human beings. The effort was not to kill a bunch of people. It was to better train and be better equipped against these viruses. But there's all kinds of people throughout the world who have warned, don't do these things. This is a mistake. You are not helping, you are hurting. And it seems to me, I know that we're all supposed to just listen to the experts, but this is an ethical issue. And it's an issue about our dollars. And it seems to me that the American people should be brought into this discussion, because I'm pretty convinced that they would want to be in this discussion, and they would want to be able to decide, are we going to be spending money to try to create what could be huge problems? And let's hear why shouldn't the American people be informed on both sides of this? What does Fauci say? What do other people say about why you should do this? Because they may have some good arguments. I'm not certain that that's not something that should be done, but I'd sure like to know more, especially since they're using my tax dollars. And so this is the sort of thing that the media should be forcing a bigger discussion about this. But the media is not forcing bigger discussion. So often, instead of forcing a bigger discussion, they're telling us everything's decided. They're telling us, don't worry your pretty little head about this. The experts have it all under control. That's why the experts will tell you, don't wear a mask. Masks are they're going to have no impact whatsoever. They're not going to help you at all. You're going to see constant commercials, or not commercials, but constant little segments on the TV news explaining from the experts why you don't need to ever wear a mask. And then a few weeks later, those same experts are going to tell us we must have masks and we must wear them. And that's a little bitty part of how bad the experts have been on this whole coronavirus. But I'll tell you, we do not want government by experts, and we do not want anyone, no matter how talented they are medically, to be making what are our ethical and political decisions. Give us the information and let us make the decision. And that is something, it's so scary to see that just seems to be drifting away. Just keeps running away. That the whole idea that we should be given information to make decisions as American citizens, no, nobody seems to think that anymore. Instead, we should listen to this expert. Well, not that expert, this expert over here. This is how republics die. And we have to, this isn't just about the coronavirus or just about this one little deal in Wuhan or whatever. This is about whether the American people are in charge of their government. And right now, I submit to you, we're not. And until we are vulnerable. We are in terrible danger.
Now, it sounds to me like you're also implying that the media likes it that we're not in charge. That is, the mainstream corporate media doesn't like citizen-controlled government. They prefer control by experts, it looks like to me. And that's...
Yes, well, for one, it's easier to cover. If it's citizen control, you got to know what's going on all over the country. You got to know what movements, what undercurrents are happening in different places. If it's ruled by experts, you get the press release. You ask a couple questions, maybe. Half the time it seems like they don't, but you should maybe ask a couple questions to make it look good. And then you publish the story. And if you were wrong, it turns out I was wrong. Well, I asked an expert. I had the official government expert on that. I talked to a congressman. He's official. But they don't talk to the public. They don't. And see, I've seen this for years. I've noticed that when it came to issues like term limits, pretty big issue for me and a big issue for the country, that you would see stories where they would be talking to all lobbyists and capital insiders and politicians, none of whom like term limits. And the whole theme of the story would be how unpopular term limits were. Right after they had passed by like 75% of the vote, we're being told in newspaper stories that they're unpopular because they haven't talked to any of us. They've only talked to the experts, the political experts, the lobbyist experts, the academic experts. And it's a huge problem. And it's one that we will continue to bitch and moan about loudly.
Now, there's one part of that story that's juicy that I don't know what to make of exactly, but it's the whole Dr. Charles Lieber business that you didn't mention here in our rundown.
Yes.
And he's been indicted, and we don't know what it's going to turn out to be, but he's been indicted for lying about his relationship to Chinese. I mean, he was involved in the Wuhan research as a
Right.
nanoscientist. That's actually the part that creeps me out, because I'm not a Kurzweil fan that thinks, I'm not or what's that? Eric Drexler, the whole nanotechnology being the boon of the future. Whenever there's a boon, there can be a complete debacle too. And I'm iffy on this whole boon and debacle business. But anyway, this Lieber story is really an interesting story lurking behind the whole thing.
Yes, and I'll tell you the other part of that, the other shoe that really isn't part of this story, but it's a part of the broader China story, is that I keep seeing these stories every couple of weeks. This professor who has just been arrested, who didn't tell his relationship with the Chinese government or with some Chinese company that's government owned, or so on and so on. And the reach of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party that rules China without any democratic check or balance, this whole, I guess, their whole philosophy has been to move into different places and use money, state money, to influence. We're seeing it all over Australia, where they're dictating to Australian universities what they should or shouldn't do and what people can say. And we've done numerous commentaries on it. And Australia's got a heck of a problem because there are so many Chinese students, and because the Chinese government has their nose in a whole bunch of things and their fingers in a whole bunch of things, and they're funding things. So people who like money, and I haven't ever met anybody who didn't, people who like money tend to want to do the things they tell them to do. Oh, I shouldn't criticize the fact that you have 2 million people in concentration camps? Well, how much money are you giving me? So that same thing is happening in American academia. And it is related to all kinds of defense issues and very sensitive stuff. China is a big intellectual thief, and they're a dangerous military force. And we keep seeing again and again and again their reach into the U.S. and into our universities. And it's the kind of thing where it looks like a pretty good reach if they don't have any reach beyond what we've already seen in our newspapers, with this guy being arrested because he didn't disclose things, or this person being arrested because he was getting Chinese help that he didn't disclose, and then this person. I bet it's a lot deeper than we know yet. So this is, it is a big problem. It's a huge problem. And we've done the commentaries and the reporting on this too. It's a problem I don't think the media covers the way they should. And partly because the media has been leveraged monetarily by the Chinese regime as well. They have spent what has been reported to be millions of dollars with advertising in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So we've got a serious problem. Well, and Bloomberg, there was a big story that came out that we did something on a couple of weeks ago, where Bloomberg basically, it came out that they had tried to force different people to do non-disclosure agreements because they didn't want it out that they had completely caved to Chinese pressure and refused to write negative stories about negative things that the Chinese government was doing. So this is why we have spent what I think is a lot of time talking about China, because I think it's a huge threat to the world, but also because it just is such a huge corrupting influence in the United States. They are buying off, I think, an awful lot of people in academia. I think they've bought off a few politicians. I think they certainly have their hooks into a lot of business people, because the business people I want to make money. Well, if you want to make money and you don't care about any ethics or justice, well then, you're going to play ball with China. It's only when the people of the world start to say, hey, wait a second, we want to live in a free society. We like capitalism. We like making money. We like trade, but we don't want trade to lead us to a world in which we can't say what we want to say, because the butchers of Beijing have so much control and so much leverage that they can cripple and bankrupt anybody who speaks up. That's not the world we want. And on that happy note, let's go to the feel-good story of the day, of the week, which is Happy Juneteenth. And I say that just a little tongue-in-cheek, because for the most part, I'd heard about Juneteenth for a long time. And it seems to have been, almost exclusively a black celebration of the end of slavery. And the more I've heard about it, the more I think, why is there no celebration of the end of slavery? I mean, slavery is, as I say in Friday's commentary, America's original sin. And, we have every reason to be sorry that sin was ever committed. But there's a rest of the story. And I don't get in this commentary to Jim Crow days or to, the different, what's happened after slavery, because of course Juneteenth is a celebration of the end of slavery. It's not a celebration of everything that every politician in America ever did since the end of slavery. But to me, it just seems like such an obvious holiday. And it also seems to me, I think that it's easy for white folks to not want to talk too much about slavery, because there's always kind of this like, hey, somehow it's my fault because I'm white or something, which, I wasn't alive. I'm old, but I'm not that old. And of course, I think we also have to say we didn't do anything to stop it, because we weren't alive. We weren't there. But as a country, shouldn't we have to deal with the sin? And shouldn't we also deal with the fact that there was some redemption, that we ended the sinning, and that we abolished slavery and freed slaves? And yes, because both parts of it are reality. And I just think that it occurred to me that we're not doing any of the, hey, and it's not us. It's not about patting ourselves on the back. Like I've already said, we didn't have anything to do with it. We were not, we weren't even a gleam in anybody's eye. But as a country, both parts are there. And I don't think we want to spend, let's not spend a lot of extra money celebrating the end of slavery, but let's every year, why wouldn't we celebrate Juneteenth? And of course, some people may not realize Juneteenth is the day that Union troops got to Galveston, Texas, which was months after the end of the Civil War, and basically, said, hey, the Civil War is over, slaves are freed. They read a proclamation and so on. So the date of emancipation for most enslaved people in the U.S. was before June 19th. But it's become kind of a holiday, and it's probably one of the latest, situations for people to be free. So I just think, why not celebrate the end of slavery? Make it a holiday. I had my brother sent me something today, said, don't make it a new holiday. Take Columbus Day or something out. In other words, you have to get rid of one, because he's always tired about the government making you take all these days off. Come on, we have to do some work. So anyway, I'm not saying that it needs to be a new holiday. I'd be fine with getting rid of one of the old ones. I just think it's worth celebrating, and it's worth remembering that we had the terrible crime of slavery, and we ended slavery, which itself cost the lives of between 600 and 800,000 Americans on one side or the other. So,
Yeah, my only major concern is that it's just a Galveston thing. I understand that people have sort of lommed onto it, but that's not the moment of anything in a sense, just except it's just Galveston. I mean, Vermont, when it was formed as a state in 1777, made slavery illegal. I mean,
right,
I
right.
mean, I think that almost every state or many of the states could have their own separate end of slavery days, and I think that would be kind of cool, in my opinion, is to actually have 50 celebrations.
It'd be especially cool in Vermont, where they could go, yeah, we were way ahead of everybody else. Now they could kind of brag. They've got bragging rights. But again, that'd be more history learned, and that'd be good. The truth is good for people to know, but I don't think it'd be a bad thing if it was a national holiday, because in essence you could choose June 19th, and then you could celebrate. Every state could have their own thing. I mean, you don't have to. It could be an umbrella, or it could be every state. The point is, I think so often, and I saw a thing on TV today about June 19th and Juneteenth as a holiday, and it was portrayed as all a black holiday. And I guess part of it is, it seems to me this should not be a black holiday. That there seems to be such an effort to separate us. I think of George Floyd, and had a friend say to me, "Do you hear about the guy who came out in favor of the policeman, kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes?" I said, "No." He said, "That's because nobody did." And I thought, there's been such an opportunity for unity on this issue at this time. Some of these other cases, like even the case in Atlanta, I don't think this guy should have been shot. But it's a much different case. It's very messy, and you don't know what was going through different people's minds or exactly what happened. The Floyd thing's totally different. And to me, that's kind of the way I feel about this Juneteenth holiday. I don't want it to be just a black holiday. It should be a holiday for all Americans, and not that we did it, but that our ancestors did something terrible, were involved in something terrible, at least some of them. A lot of them fought it the whole time, as you point out, Vermont, and abolitionists who never supported it. But let's learn that history, and let's appreciate that with all the terrible, there was something done about it, because in our lives, there's plenty of problems. The key thing is that we do something about them.
I don't mind Juneteenth as a celebration. I think it's just that I'd like to see more of them, because slavery is really, it's something we're all against. I mean, it's not even that hard of an against. This is not something that really should divide anyone. And
Right.
And if you want to go racial on it, it is worth remembering Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain, wherein the story was there were two people who looked white, and one of them was a slave by nature, and by a switched at birth, the wrong white person was enslaved. And when the slaves were freed after the Civil War, many white people they just passed in the population. They just
Right.
became and that's it's a different part of the story, but there were white people, basically white people. I mean, people who looked white, who were slaves. It's a very odd thing, and that's not how it's usually portrayed in our movies these days, because of course that's not the main point of the story. I mean, we all know that. It's just that there were oddities about slavery.
Well, there were. Well, for instance, there were black slave owners.
Yes.
And in fact, the original case, I believe, one of the people involved as a slave owner was black. But of course, it isn't to say, I don't believe white people are all responsible for what other white people did. So it doesn't really matter to me what race the slaveholder was or the slave was. I mean, I want to know, It'd be kind of stupid to go, oh, was it really black people who were mainly enslaved? I mean, we know that was the case, and we know how people used the fact that they were a different color to be a big thing that meant they weren't really people and so on. And we got to fight all of those and learn about all those and teach our kids about all those things. But it's not, but learning that the truth that there were also black slave owners is just the truth. And what it says is it isn't all about race. There's nothing about being white that makes you evil. There's nothing about being black that makes you evil. There's nothing about being Hispanic or Asian or anything else that makes you wonderful or evil. People are people. And, so it again, the more we know, it seems to me the better it is, and the more we would tend to be unified. But no one in the political game has much of an interest in people being unified.
Some people, and they seem to be somewhat in the media as well as elsewhere, really want to divide Americans right now on these issues.
Yes.
It's kind of amusing. The funniest thing of last week, I think, was probably the pretentious and almost Chuckworthy moment when the Democratic leaders knelt. Was it knelt the floor of Capitol on the Capitol and with their special African sashes and then, of course, you heard about the upshot from that, right?
Wasn't it that somehow those sashes were worn by, slave traders or something?
Well, yeah, but, because
it's like the worst thing you could possibly wear.
Most of the people who enslaved Africans and sold them to the Portuguese and the white slave traders that brought them to the Americas were other black people. I mean, it was Africans enslaving Africans, selling them to Europeans to get to America. That is what happened. And the tribe that had those wonderful, wonderful, lovely colors. And I must say, I really do like their colors. I think they're great. And I understand why Nancy Pelosi wants to wear those colors. She needs all the help she can get in the threads department. But it was kind of amusing that they had somehow blundered into a complexity of history. In fact, that's almost what America is always doing, is blundering into the complexities of history.
You're going to do that when there is a purposeful attempt to not get into any details. I mean, when I first got to Washington, this is many years ago, I can remember people would say, as if it was wisdom from on high, that you can't transmit complex messages. We've got term limits. Of course, there weren't any terribly complex messages. Everybody got all of them pretty easily. But on different issues, you have to be careful because you don't want to make it too complicated because the American people somehow couldn't understand it if it was too complicated. And I quickly came to the conclusion that the problem was not the American people's inability to understand complex messages, because they, for a large part, could understand very complex messages. The problem was getting the media to carry your complex message to the people without screwing it up. And that's very, very difficult. So I think that's kind of appropriate here because the media is not interested in an informed electorate. And I say that just because constantly I read stories, I see things on TV, and I realize if I know anything about it, that they've left huge areas out, important facts out, important opinions on the other side of whatever network, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or ABC or whatever. They always leave the other side's arguments out. And in fact, the only time they bring them in is when they misrepresent them and use them as straw men to beat up. Where they pull out one comment, misrepresent it, and then beat up from there. But all of that, I just constantly see them wanting to tell us what we should think about what has happened, but very scant on the details about what has actually happened, as if they can't trust us to come to the right conclusion. So they're not sure which bits of information they should give us. Well, at this point, they're not providing a service. They are using their reach to try to brainwash us, to tell us only what they want us to know. And of course, I don't want to. I don't think that there are, late night and early morning meetings where they burn incense and whisper the secret codes that they're all going to do this. But the media is run by people who are on the left, not on the moderate left. As we have said numerous times, I think the lion's share of the mainstream media is to the left of the Democratic Party. And so, they think alike in the same way that I did something on Juneteenth saying, hey, bring it on. Sounds like a great holiday. And Reason had something today. I went to the Facebook and put something on my page with mine, and then I saw something from Reason. They had the exact same take on it. Now, I didn't crib what they did. They didn't crib what I did. We didn't talk to each other. Why did we have the same take? Because we have the same political philosophy, and we saw something and we had the same take. That happens all the time in the mainstream media. And in fact, that's why last week's story about the New York Times and getting rid of an op-ed page editor, the guy who put Tom Cotton's op-ed in is gone. And he's gone not because the public revolted, but because the New York Times newsroom reported. The people reporting the news at the New York Times did not like Tom Cotton's opinion and do not want an opinion they don't like that to be in their newspaper. That's a whole different world. And it shows how dangerous it is in this current environment where you're going to get only narratives from the media. And that's true at Fox. Fox it's nice to have somebody on that side, because as I pointed out to people, I don't think you can be a well-rounded reader and somebody who's interested in current events and not go to Fox News, because there's all these stories that only Fox News will cover. I mean, you would know almost nothing about the IRS scandal from years ago if you just watched MSNBC and CNN and the ABC, CBS, NBC network. They didn't cover it at all. And of course, there are things that Fox News isn't going to cover that you're going to have to go to the other ones for. That's because of all of these narratives taking over from any sort of provision of actual news from an objective standpoint. And, I question whether the media could ever be objective. And there's some point at which I think you're better off with a media that is partisan, but then you would want the media to be openly partisan. In other words, we're a Democratic newspaper. We're a liberal or progressive TV station. We're a conservative. We're a libertarian. And they don't do that. They all pretend to be objective while they're loading up their partisan vitriol and dumping it on us.
Well, in the old days, before we were born, all the major newspapers were basically named. You could tell what the affiliations were.
Yes.
Or often you could. And
yes.
Certainly in the early days of the newspaper, at Jefferson's times, there was a Federalist newspaper or a Democratic Republican newspaper, and that was it.
I think when I think of nasty media, you think of Jefferson's time, and then I think of our time being similar to that. But the big difference being they were openly on this side or that side. They openly stated where their politics was, whereas our media totally pretends that they're objective and has no political view whatsoever, which I don't know how anybody watching for 3 seconds could believe that.
You have been listening to Paul Jacob talk about the big stories that appeared this week at thisiscommonsense.org. My name is Timothy Virkla. You can find me at Workman on social media. That's Workman with an I, not an O. And this podcast, This Week in Common Sense, can be found on SoundCloud and via podcatchers such as Apple, Google, and Stitcher. You can also find it on YouTube. Thank you.